So please join me in welcoming Holland Cotter.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming tonight. Thank you. And I'd like to particularly thank Laura, the Ananda Kumaraswamy Curator of South Asian and Islamic Art at the MFA, for inviting me to speak to you. I hope you will forgive me in advance for two things. One, for having a limited number of pictures to show you, though the ones I do have are very nice ones, of things that you can easily find on display in the museum today. And two, I feel I should perhaps apologize for the sentimental title I've given my talk, Babysat by the Buddha. I couldn't help it. I considered more dignified, academic, adult-sounding titles. But as for sounding like an adult, I'm over it. It's not going to happen, if it ever did happen. More important, coming back to the MFA tonight feels very much like a homecoming to me. And more than that, like coming back to my early childhood, when I spent formative time here. Things have changed in this museum, because everything changes all the time. But the core hasn't changed. The art and the experience of it hasn't changed. And you know how it is when you revisit the home you grew up in. I'll speak for myself on this. All the structure and discipline you've developed to meet the world tends to fall away, and for better or worse, you are once again the kid you were all those many years ago. When I come to the MFA, this reversion is always for the better. I see objects and images that I remember as old friends, companions, teachers, spiritual advisors, art that very early on inspired affection and awe in me, and still does. After some 40 years of writing about art, and more than 25 years of those years at the New York Times, it's refreshing to get a sense of how my attraction to it began. And I get that refreshment in this museum. My guess is that many of you here tonight have similar or comparable stories to tell. I'm sure many of you also discovered art at a very young age, and I'm always interested in the particulars of what triggered that discovery for other people. As Laura mentioned, I grew up not far from here in Weston, a suburb about 15 miles out by the Mass Pike Extension. I was in a family of readers and book lovers, and my first exposure to art that I remember was through books. I still recall from when I was very young, preschool, taking full, fascinated possession of a book I found on the living room table in my home. A large format edition with full color plates of paintings in the collection of the Louvre. Don't ask me why, but at that tender age, Tiepolo became the go-to artist for me. Maybe it's the fact that everyone in his painting sits on clouds that was the appeal. And I remember at my grandparents' house coming across a several-volume set of books by the late 19th century travel writer John L. Stoddard. Stoddard was born near here in Brookline in 1850. He traveled and photographed extensively in Asia and made a career of lecturing on what he saw. By today's standards, these reports sound hopelessly Orientalist, but I didn't and couldn't read his words. I could only look at his pictures of China, India, and Japan. The reproductions were dim and washed out, but the images of Japanese temple interiors and of Shinto shrines at Nikko were some of my earliest impressions of art as a total environment, something that you could walk into, that envelops you, an idea I've always loved. Many years later, experiences of such environments, church interiors in Europe and the Americas, mosques in Africa, and temples and shrines in Asia have been among the greatest joys of my life. In a modest way, our home was an aestheticized environment. My mother loved old things. She still does. She lives in New York now. I spent many summer days with her poking around in New England antique shops. Her tastes were eclectic, but she was particularly interested in China trade porcelains and Japanese export wares, which back then, it's the 1950s we're talking about, were still plentiful and a bargain. All through my childhood, a small white porcelain Chinese Buddhist figure of the Bodhisattva, Gauguin, sat by itself on a table in our living room. The statue wasn't, I later learned, very old, but to me, it was an emotional treasure. It was calming to look at with its mild but welcoming smiles. It was reassuringly gender neutral, though more feminine than not. It was animated by histories I didn't yet know and by the spirit of places I hadn't yet seen. I was soon relating in the same way to Buddhist images I encountered here at the MFA. It won't surprise you to learn that we were a museum-going family. My father and mother were adventurous, independent-minded people, the direct opposite of the helicopter parents of today. They gave me a lot of personal space to grow in and seemed to trust that I would make my way through it responsibly. On Saturday mornings during our long New England winters, they routinely drove into Boston, deposited me here at the museum, and went off to do whatever they needed to do for most of the rest of the day. Speaking of babysitters, they spent very little money on babysitters. This was in the 1950s, when museums were very different institutions from what they are now. Even on weekends, they were quiet and empty, a lot like libraries. This was a time before blockbusters and before museums became all-purpose social spaces and tourist destinations. I seem to remember that there being a lunchtime cafeteria on the premises then, but I have a sense that it was a somewhat funky, ad hoc arrangement. I don't remember massive school groups being herded through like they are today, and I certainly was never part of one of those groups. I was on my own here, basically in the protective custody of the guards. I must have looked pretty together, even purposeful as a child. I always carried a book and a pad of paper, and they let me go wherever I wanted, which meant everywhere in the museum. I wandered the galleries on self-docented tours. No one was saying to me, "Look at this because it's great, but never mind that." So to me, all the arts of all the cultures in the museum collection were equal. I just followed my nose, stopped at whatever caught my eye. I can still recall the exhilaration of freedom that came with doing that. I love to do it today. And I remember images I saw. I was strongly attracted to particular personalities seen in portraits and bonded with some of them. I think a lot of regular museum goers do this, develop personal relationships with certain objects and images, partly because they're inherently attractive, but also because over time, they give you a kind of secret insider connection to the institution, where other visitors drift cluelessly from gallery to gallery. You have destinations. You're here to see old friends. I do this kind of networking in the galleries at the Met all the time. No matter what else I'm there for, I try to drop by to say hi to the wonderful carved wood Gauguin couple in the African gallery, and the 12th century Swedish Virgin with the face of a dove in the medieval hall, and the fabulous Chola bronze sculpture of the dancing child saint Sambandar, a piece that was once owned by the collector Bobby Ellsworth in the Indian galleries. And here at the MFA, I try to track down old friends too, which I was just doing the last hour before I came here. It was great to see, well, some of them I'll mention here, actually. I revisited them. Speaking of which, let me put a slide up here. It's up, good. This is one of my old friends from my childhood. For me, the Egyptian galleries in the museum at the MFA, which are famous, of course, world famous, they're extraordinary, but they were a big early attraction for me. They are for lots of kids. There's just something about those mummies. The idea of dead people wrapped and boxed and on display is just irresistibly shuddersome, even though the faces painted on the coffins aren't. They're bright-eyed, with confident smiles, and they all look about the same age, just about hitting their 20s. But this Egyptian face, I kept coming back to. It belonged to a very alive-looking man named Ankh-Haf, who served as a senior administrative official to the 4th dynasty pharaoh Chephren, the builder of the second pyramid at Giza. Depicted life-size and at bust length, Ankh-Haf looks to be in early middle age, where many other bust-length tomb figures from the time tend to have generalized features. They could be portraits of anyone, bought off the rack. There's nothing boilerplate about his. With lines in his cheeks and bags under his eyes, all the details are molded in plaster over a carved limestone core. He actually looks familiar to me, or he did when I was a kid. Right away, I said, I recognize this guy. He closely resembled my great-uncle George. George was a hard-working Boston lawyer and a nice, worried guy who I usually saw only at family Christmas gatherings, when he looked like he would rather be somewhere else, though he always managed to slip me a good luck silver dollar as he headed for the door. I just revisited my great-uncle George half an hour ago upstairs. I also bonded in a different way with El Greco's 1609 portrait of Hortensio Paravicino, a scholar monk and a friend of the artist. Purely from a graphic perspective, the picture is a stunner. With those fields of black and white and a central whisper of blue and red, it projects dramatically from across a room. I'm certain that those formal features registered with me when I was a little kid, but it would be many years before I would be able to articulate that. What I do remember noticing at the time were Hortensio's almost impossibly elegant hands, which seemed at least as alive to me as his face. And what I really liked was the fact that he was holding books. As I've mentioned, my family, mother, father, younger sister Consuelo, and I, were avid readers. Our idea of an ideal night at home was to have a quick early dinner and then to retreat to our rooms to read in bed into the wee hours, often accompanied by pets. We had many pets. We had, at the time this talk covers, we had 3 Afghan hounds that we inherited from in-town friends who found them unmanageable. We love them. We had 13 cats, indoor and outdoor. We had a horse that we boarded nearby. We had 2 rabbits, Tom and Isabel, who were named for family friends who later became ex-friends. And we had a blue jay that I raised from a chick. I found him after a storm. His name was Dizzy. So it was a full house. And a lot of these people came to, people came to read with us. Anyway, as I was saying, so we're in bed reading. And on snow days at home, we had a lot of snow days. It was the same drill. So it's not surprising that I initially mistook Hortensio's religious habit for sleepwear. I thought he was wearing a bathrobe and a nightshirt. I learned much later that he was, in addition to being a scholar, he was a poet. He wrote a florid, very flattering sonnet to El Greco to express his appreciation for doing this beautiful portrait. And he was much influenced by an earlier Spanish poet, Luis de Góngora, who appears in a portrait by Diego Velázquez, which is in the museum collection here upstairs. Today, I appreciate the Góngora portrait for being what it is, an acute psychological study. But as a kid, if I noticed that picture at all, I probably just saw some grouchy old guy, and who cared? It was a different Velázquez portrait that caught and gripped my attention. His 1632 double portrait of Don Baltasar Carlos and a dwarf. That's the title, Don Baltasar Carlos and a dwarf. What, I wondered, was the story behind this puzzling image? I'm looking at it when I'm 9 years old, maybe. I first took it to be of 2 children, one blonde, one dark-haired. And although they seemed to be boys, both wore skirts, and this interested me a lot. The mystery deepened when I learned that the blonde figure was the 2-year-old son of the King of Spain, Philip IV, and the dark-haired figure, who I had assumed to be his playmate, was actually an adult, who Velázquez has reduced in the painting to the stature of a servant. The blonde prince stood center stage in the spotlight, looking blankly off somewhere, a mini potentate. The dark-haired figure was crowded into the painting's lower corner, where he deferentially turned his head toward the prince, with an expression that to my eyes, and this changed as I looked at this painting, I came back and back and back to it, an expression that to my eyes seemed weary and maybe harassed. With this picture, entire worlds of social and ethical history just began to crack open for me. Art with stories attached to it has always pulled me in. I love stories. I didn't go to the Greek galleries here because I found classical marble sculpture to be, on the whole, a snooze. Ancient Greek ceramics, though, were another matter. Encased in high old glass vitrines, which I believe were still in use in the 1980s, they were hard to see, but just a few glimpses of red and black painted vases, cups, and bowls told me that these items of tableware were adorned with some of the most violent images in the entire museum. This scene, on a gracefully shaped, high-handled cup, which shows an erotically omnivorous Zeus chasing some prey. It's a nymph on one side of the cup and the child Ganymede on the other, is a relatively tame example of what I'm talking about. Even so, in this Me Too moment, we may find that this image is a lot less amusing than it probably was as a party joke to its original owners. And there's this 18th century shocker. What kid wouldn't be riveted by Watson and the Shark? Painted in 1778 by the Boston-born artist John Singleton Copley. The scene is set in Havana Harbor in Cuba, and it depicts the heroic rescue of a 14-year-old British cabin boy, Brooke Watson, who lost a leg to a shark, but survived to become Lord Mayor of London, which happened to be the city to which Copley had moved not long before he painted this picture. The MFA version is a replica that Copley painted from the original, which is now in the National Gallery in Washington. And there's a third version, slightly smaller, in Detroit. You can see where the picture would be much in demand. It's Jaws before Jaws. And it still packs a punch. It was a picture I came back to repeatedly when I was a kid, like I would go to a horror movie or something. This is one of my favorite things in the museum. On a gentler note, the MFA also has Roger van der Weyden's altarpiece called St. Luke, painting the Virgin. The foreground tableau of the Virgin and Child was a theme familiar from thousands of Christmas cards in the 1950s, when religious imagery was still common in American popular culture. But what intrigued me in the painting was less the main action than the universe of detail in the background. Exactly what city is this, with its microscopic bridges and streets? It certainly wasn't my idea of Bethlehem. And who were these people, backs turned to us, oblivious to the divine events taking place in their neighborhood? And who on earth could paint with such fine, realistic precision? Well, St. Luke could. And there he was, tiny brush poised to prove it. One of the first modernist paintings I fell for at the MFA was this enigmatic 1897 narrative by Paul Gauguin, titled, "Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going?" Those philosophical questions add up to a lot of weight for one painting to carry. Maybe that's why Gauguin made it so big. It's nearly 13 feet long. And he did provide explanatory keys for the narrative. To the right, in response to the question, where do we come from? A child has just been born. In the center, illustrating what are we? Everyday activities seem to be in progress. To the far left, in answer to the question, where are we going? An elderly woman is seen dying. As a kid, I didn't know any of this, but I was caught up in the drama anyway. In part, I think, because of the picture's environmental scale. The painting was walk-in, live-in size, as big as a room, as big as a movie screen. Looking back now, I'm pretty sure it was a real walk-in environment at the MFA, an atmospheric installation of work from Asia that did the most to shape the direction that my interests and involvement in art would eventually take. But let me insert here a little more background autobiography. In the same year my parents were dropping me off at the museum on Saturdays, I was attending school during the week. My father was at that point a young medical doctor, just beginning a practice. We didn't have a lot of money, but my parents wanted to send me to a school where I could learn languages and have exposure to art and music. So although they were not at all religious, my mother had been brought up Christian Scientist and then married a doctor, of course, which was a bad idea. They enrolled me at a local Catholic school run by a French-speaking order of nuns. The bilingual education part didn't work out too well. Although the nuns, who were Canadian, spoke French among themselves, classes were conducted in English. But the art education did work out. Unusually, I think, for an elementary school. The emphasis was not on making art, but on studying art history. The nuns were really into it and introduced us to pretty much the whole Western span, secular and religious, ancient and modern. We were given postcard-sized prints, which of course I pored over and carried around with me everywhere. For a while, my favorite painting in the world was Matisse's Blue Window. Its sheer oddity of form and space, plus its palette, probably paved the way for my love for the big Gauguin. And there was another important dimension to my art learning. I think this is maybe the most important one, actually. The school had a small chapel within the main building. And to avoid going to the playground at lunchtime, which I hated to do, I used to sit in the chapel by myself. It was filled with statues, most of them statues of saints, wood-carved in a kind of sleek Danish modern 1950s style. And they all carried symbols that identified them as having distinctive stories and personalities. I also noticed that periodically, small offerings would be placed as gifts in front of the saints. A vase of flowers, or a candle, or maybe a holy card. So I understood these statues as being in some sense alive. There was a material interaction between them and the world. The images were in some real sense animate, proactive. They didn't just stand there. They did things. You looked at them and they looked at you. You gave them something and they gave you something in return. Blessings, good luck, or whatever. And I ended up bringing that idea of interactivity with me when I came to the museum, which I did soon after I started school at this school. I remember two environments at the MFA, both of which still exist. One, installed in a small room off the European painting galleries, I just was up there, is a fantastic 12th century Spanish Byzantine fresco of Christ in Majesty. He's flanked by symbols of the 4 evangelists, and the 12 apostles are lined up below, some not quite intact. The Christ, with his amazing planetary eyes and 2 wand-like fingers raised, seems to be toppling forward out of his mandorla. You can't get it in the slide, but if you go upstairs and see this, you'll see what I mean. It's as if he's about to crash down on you. An effect I remember finding awesome but unnerving. So although I would return to this installation, I never spent a lot of time in it. The other environment, and the one I truly loved, and still do, was the Japanese Buddhist temple room, an architectural enclosure within the Japanese galleries. Here, for me, all the things I looked for and wanted from art, personalities, stories, and a sense of immersion, came together. Built in 1909 by American and Japanese craftsmen, the design of the room was based on a circular hall in the 8th century temple of Horiji in Nara, Japan. The Boston version holds 7 life-size or near life-size carved sculptures set between tapering pillars. I should say that at the moment, the conservation is going on with these images. The central image I'm going to mention is still there, and 2 others are, but the other 5 are now in an area that's in front of a conservation area that's enclosed in front of the temple room. So you can go into the temple room still, you can get the effect, but some of the sculptures are, and everything's visible. It's a wonderful thing that's going on up here. That you can actually see all this conservation happening right in front of you. It's terrific. Anyway, as I said, the Boston version holds 7 life-size or near life-size carved sculptures set between tapering pillars. In the center, across from the entrance, let's see if we can get it over here. Yes, in the center, across from the entrance, and raised on a lotus throne, is a gilded image of the Buddha of eternal radiance, who grasps his left hand index finger in a fist made with his right hand, a symbol of wisdom achieved. He sits confidently upright and alert, face forward. His body is tight and firm as his gesture. Beside him, to his right, is a different manifestation of the Buddha, this one with a more relaxed, inward-looking demeanor. His shoulders are rounded, his body is softer, his head tilted slightly down, his hand cupped in his lap, as if he were lost in thought. This is the Amida Buddha. And in the niches on either side of the 2 of them stand 2 figures who project a very different mood. They are regal bodyguards, fully armored, fiercely scowling, poised for combat. As it happened, because of my love of the Guanyin image in my parents' home, I had become a little familiar with the Buddhist story by the time I was 10. In a very simplified form, he was the prince who left home to wander the world and to bring peace to everyone. That's how I understood him. And once I found the Japanese temple room with its charismatic images, I kept coming back to it. It became my default destination in the museum. For one thing, there were benches for sitting. The lighting was low, but not too low for reading, if you had 10-year-old eyes. And there was almost never anyone else there. I spent many winter afternoons daydreaming in that soothing place and feeling quite territorial about it. It was a home away from home, a place where I was watched over. Gorgeous. And let me just say in conclusion, let me say this in conclusion, that one thing in conclusion, before I say the rest, is that the Asian collection here is one of the greatest in the world. And it disturbed me and distressed me in years past to see the real estate given to it shrink. I think it should be given huge amounts of space, generous amounts of space. There's nothing like it in this country, certainly. But the Japanese collection was famous when I was a kid. I mean, I didn't just wander into it. It was a known thing, a big deal, and it still is a big deal. Same with the Indian collection. So I hope it gets a huge amount of play in the years ahead, and it could not be under better leadership than Laura's. The Buddhist art in the Japanese galleries encouraged me to explore the much earlier Buddhist work in the museum's South Asian collection, the core of which had been assembled, as we've heard, in the early 20th century by the scholar-philosopher Ananda Coomaraswamy. In that collection, I discovered a different, highly charged spiritual energy in images of the Buddha, like this one from 5th century India, that radiated not only personality plus, but an undisguised sensuality. The facial features are modeled not on idealized human forms, but on elements in nature. Eyes are based on the shape of lotus buds. Curls of hair are shaped like snails. Plush lips like ripe fruit. This was art that offered a new way, and still offers a new way, of looking at the world. A world that encompassed all life. A world in which divinity was built in. In this environmentally stressed out time, this seems like a hugely important message to absorb. Unbelievably beautiful. And in the South Asian galleries, I came across one of the museum's supreme treasures. This figure of a Yakshi, or earth spirit, from one of the stone-carved gateways at the Great Stupa at Sanchi in central India, dating from sometime between 25 BC and 25 AD. She's a guardian of the Buddha too, but one who is armed not with swords or spears, but with generosity, fruitfulness, and joy. Years and decades have passed, and what I saw and learned at the MFA in this museum has taken me to dozens of countries in Europe and to Africa. It has taken me to Japan on a Buddhist pilgrimage, and to India and Nepal on our history treks. It took me, as Laura mentioned, to graduate school, and by a very roundabout route, to the New York Times. When the Times approached me to write for them, the editors invited me in for a chat. During it, one of them asked, "So what are you working on these days?" I assumed he meant what newsy art stories did I have up my sleeve. I said, I'm doing research on early Indian Buddhist art, thinking, oh man, they're never going to go for that. But they went for it. I guess they wanted to expand their horizons. And that's exactly what the Museum of Fine Arts, my museum, did for me. I remain very grateful, and I'm very glad to be home tonight. Thank you.
We have time for about 3 questions tonight. If you just raise your hand, someone will bring a microphone to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer any. I can see you now. This is great. I'll be happy to answer any questions people have. Yes.
How do you like the Met by comparison?
I don't have the same, I've lived in New York for 40 years now, so I am sort of I'm a New Yorker, but I don't have the same emotional attachment to the Met as I have here. And really, images here are the foundation for me, that they're in this collection, because they're the ones I saw so young and absorbed and learned from. The Met Asian collection can't, at least the South Asian collection, can't compare with this museum's collection. The only part of it that's perhaps comparable or superior would be the Chola bronzes, which are just amazing at the Met. But the early stuff, this is like unbelievable, and it's here. Nobody else has anything like that. I love them both. I love both museums, though. I love museums, period. Yeah.
I'm like the person they hid in the audience to make sure there's another question. I wondered if you ever worked on projects that help children explore art, because you do have this connection to your youthful discovery of it, and it makes me just think that I would love to get my kids in a room with you looking at some sculptures or some paintings, because you do have a way of breaking it down and bringing it alive.
I've never done that. The only teaching I've ever done actually was with adults at Columbia when I was as a graduate student. I took over Vidya's. Vidya Deheja was our, we studied with Vidya Deheja at Columbia, and she was our advisor. And when she went to India to do research of her own, I took over her class for a year, and Indian and Islamic. And that was a great experience. I loved it. But it was many years ago. I find teaching is enormously energy consuming and difficult. You know, it's not easy, it's not a breeze. And so I'm waiting until I leave the work I do now to go back into teaching again so I can really give it my attention. I don't know what level I'll be teaching, but it won't be graduate school level. It's much more likely to be in high school, that kind of thing. And I'd love to introduce young people to this field, the field of South Asian art. They really should know about it. So,
This is too big a question, but you review contemporary art as well as historical art. How do you think the best contemporary art compares to the best art of the past?
yeah, that's a tough one. It's almost, it's a little bit apples and oranges, I think. You know, I started out actually as a contemporary art reviewer. That's where I came into the field back in the 70s when I first moved to New York. And the art was small, and there was new things happening. And then I moved up the East Village in the 80s when that scene just totally exploded. So everything I was looking at was made literally yesterday. So there's no history, you know, for that stuff. I was the historian for that stuff, which is weird. And what took me to graduate school was the dissatisfaction of being that kind of historian. I felt I was not learning enough. I wasn't knowing enough. I didn't have enough depth to my thinking. I didn't have a basis of comparison. So it was only, that's what took me back to school. And once I was in school, I was in heaven, you know. I graduated from college in 1970 and then didn't go to school and I was very glad to get out of college. I had had enough, I didn't want any more. It was a politically stressful time. I went to Europe for a year, I just had to get away. And I thought I would never go back to school again. When I went back to school at Hunter, City University of New York, I was working full-time in a computer center during the day, and I went to school at night, one class at a time for some years. I was an excellent, happy student then, because it was something I wanted to do, and I was doing it, and for me, you know. So I'm kind of dancing around your question. I don't know what to say. I love both. I love the phenomenon of art. I love the phenomenon of people making things that have objects that have ideas in them, and videos that have ideas in them, and conceptual art that has ideas. You know, all of that. The whole thing is just one on a spectrum to me. So I love it all. I'm so grateful I've got a chance to do it all too. That's really good.
This will be our last question of the evening.
So much of the art that you've talked about, both Western and Eastern, arose out of a deeply religious and spiritual culture world. We're now, of course, in a world that's far more secular and divorced from much of that. What can we, in our modern secular secular point of view, what can we best learn from the art that arose out of those deeply spiritual roots?
I was interesting that in the current Whitney Biennial in New York, which opened last week, for the first time in a long time, I saw the inclusion of artists whose work is spiritually based, literally based on spiritual practices. And this is almost not admitted to museums like the Whitney today, or hasn't been for a long time. But one of them is Afro-Puerto Rican artist, and another is an African-American artist who is a Santeria priestess and creates work out of that practice, which she's taken to Cuba and she's taken to Nigeria, and she's exchanged information with practitioners there. So it may be that this is coming back into the culture, into art culture. I'm hoping it is. I mean, that's just one of the beauties. Right now, people have a lot of problems with what's going on in art, but because it seems to be you can't pin it down. You can't give it a name or a movement or say this trend is dominant. For me, that's great. I'm glad that things are diffuse in that way, because it gives room for for lots and lots of things to come in, and this is one of the things I think may be coming back in again. I'm hoping it is, because it means a lot to me. Oh, we're done. We're done. Okay.